I'm mainly going to make responses to Dominic's presentation and to the report, right? So I'm not going on my own tangent. I'm just really responding, and I'm trying to add things and perspectives and perhaps some evidence that will just support and things that I thought were necessary in addition to the report. So I'm just going to discuss the assessment of South Africa's debt profile, how we frame this problem, and then looking at recommendations for reducing the cost of borrowing. And then finally, just a quick note on IFI debt, International Financial Institutions debt. So as Dom said, we are unlikely to default anytime soon. Foreign debt is less than 10%, and we've got large reserves, large amounts of state assets. We've got Jafurka, which is at about 460 billion rands, and the risk of default is not high enough for us to take seriously this narrative that's often pushed by the private sector, pushed by the national treasury to scare us into an austerity budget, right? And that's essentially the tact, right? To scare us into austerity without taking responsibility for the fact that the growing deficit that they are financing through debt is a result of poor government planning and poor ambition to change the structures of our economy. So Bloomberg, for example, estimates the likelihood of default in the next 5 years to be around 10%. And I would just like to add to this that although we don't face kind of this immediate debt or liquidity crisis, there is increasing risk, associated with state failures and no or low prospects for growth that we need to take seriously in this conversation as well. So the effect of this is kind of higher costs of borrowing, which I'll describe when I turn to the yield curve in a bit. So we're unlikely to default anytime soon, but we do have a problem. And this problem has to do with global conditions, but also from our own goals, right? So we have short-term concerns around currency depreciation, on external debt, rising interest rates, declining commodity exports, and declining growth in other parts of the world amongst our leading trade partners, and of course our own goals that we love to score in this country. And we do have a structural long-term problem that exists for development that's related to our growth, and that's that if you choose to finance the deficit using debt, and your interest rate is a lot higher than your rate of growth, you're eventually going to come into a problem of not being able to finance that, if that is your strategy, right? So this is South Africa's bond yield. The bond yield is basically a curve that explains how much you are what is the interest rate on your borrowing at different points in time. So the South African government sells bonds at 3-month, 5-year, 10-year, 20-year, and 30 years, right? And one curve is looking at what is the cost of that borrowing for those different debt instruments, or in other words, for those different kinds of bonds that have different maturities on them, right? And sorry, you might not be able to see, but it goes 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023. So we can see that there's been quite a drastic increase in the cost of our borrowing over the last 4 years. For example, in 2020, a 3-month bond was below 4%, and last year a 3-month bond was sitting at around 7%, right? So the cost of borrowing in this country has doubled over the last 3-4 years, right? And this is concerning, and it's making the financing of the budget through debt very expensive, right? I know that others will have perspectives around monetary financing, and we can discuss that in the discussion session. That's fine. But what we see here that I just want to mention as well is that our long-term debt. So the interest rate that that the state has to pay on 30-year bonds is 12%, 12.8%. But the interest rate that we have to pay on 3-month bonds is 8.7%, right? So this is what we mean by upward sloping yield curve. It's clearly more expensive to borrow on the longer end of the curve than it is on the shorter. But having a curve that looks like this also says that people don't trust us to pay in 30 years as much as they do right now, which is a concern around the long-term growth of the economy, right? So with growth at around 1.2% and debt that's costing between 8 and 12%, if we continue borrowing, we will eventually run into serious problems. And as was mentioned, there's no magic number around debt to GDP that is sustainable. It depends on what your interest rates are. It depends on a whole range of factors, and the nature of your bond market. So, I mean, as you can see, South Africa's debt to GDP is I think it's 72%, right? It's at about 72%, which doesn't seem so weird compared to all of these other countries. It's in line with upper middle income countries. It's slightly more than Africa. It's slightly more than other lower middle income countries. But in general, it doesn't seem like a big deal at the moment. The thing that we should really be looking at is the interest payments to GDP, which are both flows. I don't want to get them mixed up or be accused of that, but those are both flows. And for South Africa in 2022, our interest payments related to the bond yield, the interest rates that we pay on our bonds, is far higher than most other African countries, far higher than upper middle income countries, more than double. And that is a concerning thing, and really one of the things that we need to consider reducing through a range of policy tools that we'll discuss it in a second. So this is just a quick graph just to reiterate some of the issues that we have with financing the deficit through debt and through tax. Is this widening gap between tax and debt, even when taking into consideration the size of the economy, it is a concerning picture. And this has been the trajectory consistently since the financial crisis. And there's this growing gap between tax revenue and net loan debt. And without economic expansion, debt levels may surpass the ability for government to service it. And the National Treasury has cited this as the leading motive for their austerity policies. And according to National Treasury, the central goal of fiscal policy is, quote unquote, to stabilize the national debt to GDP ratio by closing the budget deficit. And I think that what we need to say is that needs to not only look at stabilizing national debt to GDP, it needs to look at reducing the cost of borrowing, especially for strategic sectors. And the Minister of Finance knows this, the ruling party knows this, and the National Treasury knows this, and they know the implication of this on people's lives that we've been discussing today. And just to quote the National Treasury, they have said, open quote, acting too quickly to reduce the budget deficit could hamper service delivery, delay economic recovery, and compromise tax revenue collection. So they know, but they'll still do it. And they will likely do it regardless of the consequences. And I think here the framing is important, right? When we're talking about debt, our structural debt problem that I've described is the result of government's failure to use resources, whether it's debt, tax, or money, to finance programs of export-led or import-substituting industrialization. And that expands the productive capacity of the economy, and fails to provision for sustainable social provisioning. This is the case regardless of how that program is financed, whether it's through debt or money or tax. And the government failure must be identified as the failure, and the debt position as a symptom. So the AIDC report is excellent in going through a range of policy recommendations around what to do about this situation. It speaks about fixing SOEs, talking about cancelling debt from state capture years, independent audits of SOEs, improving the financial reporting of SOEs, and other discussions on tax regarding tax avoidance and increasing taxes, specifically personal income tax, corporate income tax, and wealth tax. And And then there are some discussions in the report around what can be improved in local institutions with regards to capital controls and domestic resource mobilization, drawing on the Government Employee Pensions Fund and drawing on the Unemployment Insurance Fund. And another key kind of recommendation around local institutions that the report mentions that is worth reiterating is to avoid the Wall Street consensus, or to avoid the de-risking state. So avoiding using financing models that might not be overtly privatization, but putting the risks of investments, specifically in our green transition, onto government's balance sheets, right? Because there are serious implications on that for the cost of services, but also on finding yourself in the inability to finance projects, or finding yourself in a debt crisis as a result of guarantees you've offered to the private sector, who might have used that responsibly or not. So the report is quite good in offering an underlying message that the inability of government to use debt instruments to create value in the economy is a general government problem, and not necessarily one over the budget that we would analyze year to year. And that debt servicing costs are taking up a larger, and now the largest portion of the national budget, which the report says quite succinctly reflects a political decision to prioritize the repayment of debt at the expense of ensuring the provision of rights enshrined in South Africa's constitution. We would add a few more suggestions on reducing the cost of borrowing. We would say, given the shape of the yield curve, which I showed earlier, it would be strategic in this moment to borrow at the short end of the yield curve. There is definitely high returns from upscaling development banks. Sovereign wealth funds are pools of financing that resource-rich countries like South Africa could benefit from. And of course, stronger revenue collection through windfall taxes, capital gains tax, and wealth tax. And of course, preferential lending windows from the South African Reserve Bank to finance green industrial policy that will expand the productive capabilities of the economy. And then internationally, as was mentioned a few times, South Africa finds itself in the international monetary hierarchy. It finds itself, as a small open economy between competing powers. And I think, this is something that we can both leverage and should leverage. And we also find ourselves as an African state in a moment when many African states are either in debt distress or are defaulting. We have, an African country defaulting every year for the past 3 years, and it's looking like that is a trend that will continue. For the state to play an activist role in the international system, we're not necessarily defaulting, but there's institutional reforms that need to happen to support African countries that are. And it's often, an important role to play as a country that isn't defaulting to support those kind of activism on the international stage, which we've done so well in the case of Palestine, and I think it's something that we should aim to do in terms of the debt crisis that the continent is facing. And some of these things would include new IMF special drawing rights disbursements, including a reallocation of SDRs through multilateral development banks, including a reform of the IMF quota system, and including an end to the neoliberal kind of conditionality that IMF programs often come with. And debt cancellation campaigns, similar to the HIPC initiative, but there's, that's just an example. It would need to be far more improved on the HIPC initiative. And a new G20 common framework for debt restructuring, in addition to upscaling multilateral development banks like the New Development Bank, the African Development Bank, AIIB, and World Bank. Although the conversation on upscaling multilateral development bank has to be tempered by the fact that there are serious conditionalities that come from multilateral development banks. We had strict conditionalities on our World Bank loan during the COVID-19 pandemic, and what borrowing from these institutions does is it locks our policy in, right? There's this policy lock-in where it doesn't matter if there's a different government in the next election, that government will be bound by the policy conditionalities of the previous administrations taking out a loan with the World Bank or whatever. So there's this policy lock-in that we have to be cautious of, because it undermines the democratic nature of our system, right? The other thing that undermines the democratic nature of our system is the fact that when there are conditionalities on loans, those conditionalities are not even tabled in Parliament, right? And I think that we need to push for any conditionalities that are attached to loans to be approved with a supermajority in our Parliament, right? Otherwise, you need 3 people to change the economic structure of our society. You need a guy from the World Bank, or you need someone from the Treasury, probably the Minister or the DG, and that's it. So you need those 3 people, one from Treasury, one from the Minister, and one from the World Bank, and they can make a decision that kind of locks our policy in for many years, right? So we need to return to kind of a democratic nature of our economy through approval of any conditionalities that come through foreign loans. So those are the main points that I would like to add to the excellent report that the AIDC has produced, and just to say thank you once again for the report, for convening us, and for the opportunity to engage robustly. Thank you.